Hey there, Daria,
Hello, David.
and welcome back, everyone, to CoolCouve. Today, we want to talk about what's been going on in
So, David,
the
tell
nation.
me, January 6th.
What the heck was that about?
What is,
I
uh,
mean, wow,
yeah.
um, that surprised the heck out of me. Um, I I didn't think it would go that far, and I started thinking about well, some of the stuff that we've been talking about is like what happens that people fall into this psychology that they become part of a mob in a riot. You know,
Mhm,
people
mhm.
that probably normally wouldn't do this by themselves. There's some extremist elements in there that, of course, were hankering to do this, like the Proud Boys and the militias and stuff. And we can get into that, but there was a lot of people there that said they came because they were called,
Mm.
and they had been. It seemed like they'd been called uh, repeatedly, especially the last 77 days after the election with the Stop the Steal stuff. So that was that constant barrage of what we're calling what um, social scientists, when they look at fascism, call the big lie, right? Just
Right,
repeating
right.
stuff over and over again. And embedded in there always is, I don't know how you think about this, but there's some elements of that are real, right? That people are feeling, that are real things that are going on that
There
people
has to
react
be
to.
a kernel of truth in the big lie, right? You know,
Right.
yeah, I do think that. And I think that although there are some people who, as you said, are sort of raring to go and have this angry military, they're not reachable. There are a lot of people that are truly suffering. And I wonder, like, what what's at work when you take people who have a legitimate concern and instead of looking at, like, why people don't believe Michael Moore, who certainly understood everything that was going on with Detroit. He's one of the people that rang the alarm bell when people weren't listening and thought that Trump was a joke. And we also know that Hitler was considered a joke and Mussolini was considered a joke, right? And instead of believing Michael Moore, they believe this billionaire who has failed in business numerous times, who has had lawsuits against him for taking advantage of workers, who has never had a day in his life that wasn't about entitlement and being feeling superior, and stomping the very people under his feet who they think he he represents.
It's really puzzling to me, and I, I just before we were scheduling this, I came across an interview with Jason Stanley, who's written a couple books on propaganda and fascism.
I mean,
I
like
think
this one.
there it is right there, right? Yeah. You told me about that. And I saw it coming across on YouTube of an interview on Amirpour and Company. And he was talking about looking at it through the lens of how you look at um, motivating people. You have to get to their gut and to their emotional viscera to get them motivated to come out. And what does that is talking about sacred values and sacred symbols. And you see that in all movements like this that he's referring to as fascist movements. And one of the things that he was saying is that there's a sense that things aren't right, that people have been betrayed, that there's a national humiliation. And I think that if I remember the description of Trump's inaugural address, that was called American Carnage, I believe, right? So there was that kind of outrage that was starting to be pumped up all throughout the also all throughout the primaries and the election cycle. Um, that came in, and the sense of betrayal, that things aren't right, that the system's rigged, right? All that stuff. If I don't win the election, it's rigged. That's
Mhm.
repeated all throughout the last 5 years, and that there's the humiliation is brought on by certain groups of people. It's just not, there's certain groups of people that are responsible for that, right? And he identified, this is again, it's Jason again, Stanley, is brought on by the left, the minorities, the elites, and the social justice movements. Those are the people that are responsible for creating this this upset and betraying the national pride. So there was a lot of conversation about um, we have to make America great again. But isn't that what the MAGA hats signs say, right? Make America great again. It isn't great now. Go back to the time where it was great. And the reason that it's not great now is because of a betrayal. And I didn't see this originally, but in the speech that Trump gave and all the other people gave on the dais, there was all that language, right? At the end of it, after Trump left and people were milling around and heading down to the Capitol, there was a 2-minute video that was shown, and it was promoting all of these themes, 2 minutes. And what Jason Stanley did was he looked at all of the images in there and the language. And he showed a direct link between previous fascist movements and the language in terms of betrayal, humiliation, and that there's certain groups of people that are the cause of it. And what he said was, you saw rockets going up in military hardware and the promise of military supremacy and a glorious technological future. Where have you heard that before? And you see that in these authoritarian states of China and North Korea and Russia, where the military might's out in the streets. And you might remember, I certainly do, that on the 4th of July, Trump wanted to have tanks and stuff out on the streets and all that parading. But they said that the infrastructure of the pavement couldn't support the tanks on the streets. So that's why they didn't do it.
I didn't know that part, really?
Yeah, that's right. But they had planes flying over and stuff like that. It's something that we don't usually see as the military display. And then he brought up this thing about, and that you saw symbols of racial unity being achieved through white Christian nationalism. Those images were primarily display. And when you saw the imagery and all the iconography in the crowd, there were all this reflection on they had flags with Jesus on them, and they had people with crosses and people kneeling and praying next to the noose standing up there. So it reminded me of witch burnings back in the day, you know.
But the illustration of the utter hypocrisy is what's so shocking about that.
Say more about that.
Well, so when I think about the effectiveness about propaganda, I think about how it gets people to vote against their own best interests,
Mhm.
like thinking a billionaire is going to help you, a working class person. And I think about how, you just got done talking about how, so there's this despair which has legitimate concerns. There's a betrayal that people feel. Maybe sometimes they can't quite put their finger on it, but they know something's wrong.
Mhm.
And then there's especially with these authoritarian things and Nazism and the authoritarian savior. But then of course you need the scapegoats. So here the scapegoats are brown and black people. But then the hypocrisy about it that doesn't fit, that gives me cognitive dissonance, is this idea of then being able to join together under this unifying mechanism that has already separated those people out as scapegoats. Huh?
And what do we what do we hear all through the election cycle and continuing on the last 4 years? It's those people coming to take your jobs, the caravans, the rapists, that kind of thing. But prior to that, starting back in the 80s, it's the hauling out. But really what's happening and you see this in books like The Death of Despair and things like that, is that the the working class blue collar jobs were hollowed out and sent overseas by the multinational corporations. So people knew something was wrong. They didn't have their jobs with living wage, with health care, with
Mhm.
benefits. And what replaced that were these service jobs where people had to work 2 and 3 jobs in order to make it happen. And this was on the heels of, and this, of course, was happening um, when back in 2008, when the Great Recession happened. So people, know that all this stuff is happening, that things aren't right, that they don't have a voice, they don't have a sense of empowerment. And then you've got this, so are all these people racist or what? And what it and then you talk about the demographic shift that's happening. The awareness that it's been repeated over and over again that the demographics of the United States through our proactive immigration policies, bringing in people, and also because people as they become more educated and have more affluence, the white people in the United States, they have fewer children. So the demographics are shifting, and by 2030 or 35, or I think it's 2050, maybe even that far out, but it's coming that the white Caucasian people who've been in power will be in the minority. So it's not necessarily what the social scientists are saying that I've read. It isn't necessarily a racist thing. It's an awareness that they no longer have power, and they're going to have to share it with other groups.
But the thing is, okay, here's the other thing, David. We are very unified economic inequity, right? I mean, and this reminds me of something that, Carlin, there's a George Carlin joke about this. It's like, and here again is that propaganda aspect. It's like the divide and conquer thing. So we actually have much more in common than we have that's not in common. So being able to make them the other when I mean, I can't help but add this in there, but there's that. We may be all over the place today, but we'll try to reel it in some way. But that amazing film called The End of Poverty with a question mark,
Uh-huh.
that very specific documentary has that question mark on it. And one of the things that was in there was the guy who wrote the book, um, Confessions of a Corporate Hitman,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So he was talking about, what happens is there's this very deliberate raping and pillaging of natural resources in these developing countries, and these corporations, they act like the mafia in as much as they go in and they saddle these people with tremendous debt while they are taking the very best aspects of their natural resources, and they leave only the dregs to them. So they are in servitude, and a lot of them, because of what's happening in their country, guess what, they come here. So I mean, there's that aspect of it as well, and they're not taking high paying jobs, they're taking these menial jobs. So the
They used
idea.
to be doctors. They used to be doctors and dentists and stuff, and they come here with that degree, and they get service jobs,
Yeah, right.
trying to make a better life for their children, who then can go to school and become professionals. Right,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
promise that America holds for them. So that. Thanks for bringing that in. That's a very interesting piece.
And the big lie that has the kernel of truth is that people can feel the very things that you're talking about, but we all know about follow the money, and yet the trail goes cold. When they're shaking their swords and having these symbols that you're talking about, they're not cognitively thinking it through. Follow the money. Who benefits? It's people like Trump and his cronies that have been uh, behind the scenes while everybody has been uh, shaking their swords, or worse, running people down in Black Lives Matter, and in North Carolina, instead of looking at the deliberate profiting and profiteering, and who is doing that. It's not the little guy that's coming in here that you were just talking about, that's trying to earn a living and trying to save his money so he can make a better life for his child. Which, hey, you remember when that used to be the American dream for everyone?
Mhm. Uh, well, at least it was written down on paper,
Yeah.
the American dream for everyone. So uh, I, the day after January 6th, I was listening to the news program and their interviews, and this just really just popped out at me, and I said, what? So this is James Baldwin in his book. It was written back in the 1950s.
Mhm.
And so this quote was brought out by Washington District Attorney Carl Racine, who was being interviewed on January 6th about the Capitol insurrection. And he quoted James Baldwin from the book Fire Next Time. Imagine, and he's quoting Baldwin, imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with the pain.
Oh, David. And, and that goes perfectly with that amazing movie that you told me about, which folks have got to see. You can see it free with your library card on Canopy.
Yeah,
So it's called White Right Meeting the Enemy. And
Daya Khan, yeah.
Diacon, that's her name. And what was so amazing about what you just said was, and I don't want to give anything away, but there is a moment in that movie where you see a very high ranking white nationalist or white supremacist or whatever, very highly violent white only person who has um, escaped the hatred. And not only has he escaped the hatred, but he does no longer hate even what he used to be. And instead, he says, when I look at people who were like me, who were brutal, who were filled with hate, who were filled with prejudice, and who wanted this white only um, enclave that called America, he sees only their suffering. He sees their pain. And that when he comes to them with that understanding that this is the healing, this is the way um, that we get people to not be influenced by the propaganda that creates this concept of us and them. And I know that you've done a lot of research, David, and we've talked about it a little bit about how creating the other, whether it's the Tutsis or the Jews, the Jewish people, or whatever, that you dehumanize them, and you create that sense of disgust, right? That
Moral
so
disgust, right. It's because of those people. And moral disgust, you actually have an upset stomach when you think about that. And so moral disgust is a very interesting phenomenon. It's actually a region in the brain called the insular cortex. Robert Sapolsky, in his new book, Behave, the biology of the best and worst of human beings, something like that. We'll have it in the link. Um, talks about that, so it can be used for good or ill. You can create that for a group, or you can create moral disgust when you look back and look at things like white supremacy and Nazis and say, well, that isn't something we want to participate in. But see, I just want to do one more little snippet from the Washington District Attorney. So he follows that up with an observation, and this was actually happening during the Congress locking down. So you have the image, you have the rioters bursting through, they're in the building. All of the senators and congressmen are in secure locations, relatively secure locations, they're locked down. And some of the legislatures are doing fundraising based on this, and they're going out and tweeting out about this and doing fundraising. This is all documented. I want to say, I can't remember who it is, but there was a very prominent figure, I think, it was
oh
Hawley and Cruz that were doing it. So this is what the Racine said. He said, politicians and leaders are actually manipulating the vulnerable people who need help from the government. They need help. They're desperate. They need help from the government. And they're doing this in order to scapegoat Black, Brown, Asian, and immigrants to fundraise. So this goes to that book that was written in 2015, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, where they talk about how people, men, especially white men between the ages of 45 and 57, are dying at an unprecedented rate. This generation is not living longer than the previous generation, but they're dying from heart disease, from overdoses, from poor health, from suicides, from taking pain medications. This is an actual phenomenon that's been tracked by the social scientists, and that's what the despair is that Baldwin is talking about. He recognized that back then.
Mhm.
This is a mechanism where people are easily to manipulate it, and the way you do that is that you tap into their despair and their humiliation, and you give them like QAnon does, very
Mhm.
interestingly, is that I got that quote here someplace.
It's a red herring, right? It's the
Yeah.
scapegoat.
So this is what here's the QAnon. This is again Stanley saying this. When people across the country, not to mention in public office, um, believe that the world is run by, so people believe this, and they've been indoctrinated into it on social media, is run by satanic pedophiles that includes top Democrats, Hollywood elites, and the Hollywood elites is the trope for anti-Semitics because everybody knows the Hollywood elites are connected to the Jewish studios and to the banks and stuff like that. So you got that trope in there.
Yeah.
And that former President Trump is leading a secret mission to bring these evildoers to justice. So there is the call to action and the what you would call the um, the reason that you can engage in violence that we saw in the
Right.
Capitol.
Right. And that
I think
craziness, that so
crazy.
I read an article in the New York Times about a woman who had been in QAnon. And so one of the things was she truly felt, which is really, really interesting in terms of cults, because they call it the cult of Trump, right? They call it, and that she said she could almost feel this weird fog, but she really believed it. And she would just keep on, in this compulsive way that she would keep feeding herself this information, even as her friends were drifting away from her, but she thought it was all them, there's something. But the kernel of truth there was that she was angry because she said the Democratic National Party had railroaded Bernie. Well, for those of us that wanted Bernie, we know that there's the kernel of truth there that turned into this huge, like, insane lie, a lie that you cannot. She says now she can't believe what she once did.
So in research I've done over the years for classes I did at Clark College, I did one on artificial intelligence and social manipulation of behaviors. And what was really interesting was that when QAnon got started, it was nothing, right? It was just a little fringe group and stuff like that. But Facebook algorithms connected up people who were interested in it. This is just the AI just going, oh, if you like this, you may like this, and likes and stuff like that. All based on just random electronic impulses. And fueled by the social media that promotes outrage. So the more likes you get about outrage, then it promotes that platform.
Mhm.
So they linked up QAnon interests with white women who are interested in alternative healthcare of all things, that they would be open and interested in QAnons. This was the computers. So the line from Jimmy Kimmel saying, I think social media is trying to kill us is pretty accurate. It's like the computers have taken over. It's nuts. It's like out of some Star Trek movie or something like that.
Truly, truly.
Yeah. So I just wanted to pause one moment and go again. So something happened in my neighborhood uh, in 2016-17 with the lead up to the 2016 election. And we had reconstituted the neighborhood in 2011. We've been running it for 6 years at that point, we had established a great relationship with the Clark County Sheriff Liaison. We had Black Watch captains, Neighborhood Watch coming through. We adopted the school. We had events after events with the PTA in the school and neighborhood picnic, we had neighborhood cleanups, graffiti cleanup, all these things going on. Wonderful stuff, you know. And then something happened, and I just went, "What?" There was a group. What's going on here? There was a group that was all energized around Trump and lock her up, that kind of ethic, right? And that you and that the that the Democrats were, QAnon hadn't come in yet, but there was something about the Democrats that and the left that you couldn't trust, and there was this feeling that you remember that Obama was talking about some of the negative things about the United States that we needed to change, right? Well, the corporate hitman stuff, you know, our relationship with the International Monetary Fund and the banks that had these awful loans that impoverished countries through selling them infrastructure they didn't need, especially power plants, if I remember correctly from that book. And when I looked at that, I said, "Whoa, wow! How do you deal with that? Because that's like baked into corporate capitalism, and the multinational conglomerates who are directed a lot by corporations in the United States." So all of that, I was just thinking about all of that, and what happened was in our neighborhood. Just a brief synopsis of it was the 2000 election was coming up, and there was some people in our neighborhood that were concerned about thefts and such like that, and they wanted to form nighttime patrols, and they were intimating that they might be armed and stuff like that. And the Trevor Martin thing had happened, and we were concerned about kind of vigilante groups and maybe even relationship. The militia movement was coming on at that time. You had Patriot Prayer and Joey Gibson happening and all those things. You might remember that, and that was all a piece of what was going on in the local Clark County Republican Party. There was a lot of tension in there about extremists taking over the party, and whether it was, just like we're having a conversation now, whether there's your establishment Republicans who were then identified as rhinos, right? Republicans in name only. Yeah. And you might remember that's how Milky and Medora came in back in 2006. Whatever election they were part of, but that was all in the mix back then. So there was a group that was a small group that was aligned with that thinking and that concern, and they created an energy around the neighborhood not being safe, and the neighborhood association had been in charge of the neighborhood for 6 years. Couldn't be trusted anymore, and it needed to move aside and make room for them. And so that's fine. We can have a conversation about,
even though none of that's true.
Well, none of that was true, but we can have a conversation about that. We can list, well, we did this, we did that, we're doing that. What part do you want to join into? Interestingly enough, none of them had ever volunteered for any of those things that we've been doing for the 6 years, for neighborhood cleanup, going out and cutting back areas of our neighborhood. We had a wetland there, and the county had stopped cutting it back, so we got out there with our power tools and did all that, and got and paid money to get one of those blue containers and put all the stuff in it and take it away. We did that. We raised money to do that as a neighborhood, cleaning it up. We had a graffiti remove the stuff. Graffiti appeared, we took it away. We had, and we all knew that the way to do crime, reduce crime and to produce safety, was to adopt a school and to make it feel like you own the neighborhood, that this was your neighborhood. People were watching out for each other. We had 29 Black Watch captains, all that stuff, But this security issue became an issue. And then we found out that one of the people that was leading it was a precinct officer who was connected to an extremist in the Republican Party, who was giving him advice and program in order to take over the neighborhood association. And so, long story short, March 2017, our neighborhood association election comes up. We have it once a year. And we found out about this group coming in, and we had to have 3 sheriff deputies there
Wow.
for people to come to be safe. In addition to the Clark County uh, neighborhood coordinator from Clark County, who was connected to the city, to the Clark County Council, come in and oversee the election. And they came in, 28 of them, and tried to take over the meeting and totally change it and replace bylaws and do all that in one meeting. And so that they were shut down in that meeting. It was overwhelming support for what we had been doing, but they lingered on and were on social media and did all that. But there's this huge divisiveness in there that we had to repair, which is what I'm thinking about now, and what social scientists and neuroscientists can tell us about a roadmap for getting out of this mess that we're in. Now, this is a national issue, but it's still happening here locally. And this is locally grassroots area. How do you make people feel like they're part of the same species rather than being part of different species? The technical term for that is pseudo-speciation. So Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Behave, the book, The Best and Worst of Human Beings, he talks about this thing called, that I reframe as no brain is an island. And he talks about this, that if you want to understand why people do certain behaviors, it's pretty complex, but there's a way that you can use this information to figure out how to help people come back in from the edges, just like the white supremacist that was out recruiting in poor neighborhoods to get guys into his white supremacist gang that went out and beat people up and marched in Charlottesville and stuff like that. When he got out of that, and a number of these people, when they got out of it, they were looking at ways to bring people back in and to heal. And they went in and tried to bring people out, and they got them into mentoring programs, started mentoring and doing things like that, all that stuff. But here's what Sapolsky says about that. And he says, to understand the neurobiology of violence, this is what we're witnessing, without understanding the neurobiology, you have to understand the neurobiology of fear to understand violence. And to understand the neurobiology of fear, you have to understand how the brain works. It isn't rocket science, it's brain science. And you have to understand that some people are set up for this from infancy, to be hardwired to be more reactive. And it's because an area of the brain called the amygdala is oversensitized by them being in an environment where there's constant fear, constant stimulation. They always have to have in their environment, in order to survive as an organism, evolutionary pressures, natural selection, all that stuff. And he says, so to understand why the behavior occurred, you have to understand this thing called epigenetics, which is the influence that of the environment has on a person as they're growing up. But wait, there's more, and I'll get into that. So to understand behavior, you have to understand what was going on 1 second before in the brain, what was going on synaptically, what electrical impulses were going back and forth. Then and then seconds to minutes before, what in the environment stimuli influenced the brain. So you think about what was going on January 6th. What was the stimulation, right, going on there? So people got there because they were hooked into this. Something hooked them into that. And then you have to understand hours and days before what hormones sensitize the person to those stimuli. And that goes back to this idea of epigenetics, and people are sensitized from birth to being in environments where they're hypervigilant, they have fear response to things that happen. So for example, a noise that you and I were sitting in a restaurant, let's say, and there's a voice that has an edge to it. And both of us sit there and they're measuring our blood pressure and they're taking our glucocorticosteroid stress hormone responses. And we would have two different responses to that voice. Myself, who grew up, might have a response. My shoulders would go up and I have triggered, and I might have images of of my mother hollering at me in a negative voice. But you might, who had a, let's say you came up from a really loving relationship and family, and that voice just walks right through.
No, I'd be the one you'd have to peel off the ceiling.
Me too. But for this, that's another story. And this is what I'm talking about.
But David,
So
can I just insert this in here when you say this? Because I want to know about what you think about this, how this fits with when I think about everything that you said. First of all, one thing I have to say, from what I understand, so all of us are hardwired for this.
exactly.
It makes me think of genotype and phenotype and nature and nurture, right?
Yeah.
So that we all have some form of trauma.
And nature is not nature or nurture. You can't separate them. They're intricately entwined together.
Right, just like our body and our brains.
Right. Even right. How about that? So Descartes, it was wrong, right? So
split. But wasn't that because, right? Wasn't that because, and I mean, I know we're all over the place today, but that was also because he had to make a deal. He had to give certain part of it to the church and the other part of it to so we have that false split.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that was dangerous times to talk about going against the church, and because that was the state, right? And there's some people that want to take us back that direction.
Indeed, they do.
They do. Yeah. So then you also have to think about weeks to months before, how did experience reshape the brain response to those forces? So the other bumper sticker is what wires together fires together. So if you constantly are wiring together those neurons that have a hypervigilant reactive response to external stimuli, and that keeps being repeated, and that shapes the brain and molds the brain into a certain response. Now, the good news is, don't get your antidepressants out yet. The good news is that you can rewire that, but it takes time to do that. But we know how to do it, and we'll get to that.
And it's synapses, right, David? I mean,
it's yes.
And it reminds me, which is so interesting because of this whole idea of like artificial intelligence. When there's a visual, I don't know if I can find one, but the visual reminds me of a computer network system. And the more you go through this process that you're talking about, the faster it gets there, just like connectivity.
Exactly. So imagine, so if you drive in a rut or walk in a path, it's the groove gets deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. I was trying to drive in the snow yesterday, and I had to drive in these ruts, and it was going in and out. But I stayed in the ruts that were already made, and I had, most of the time I made it without fishtailing and bumping into any parked cars. So then you have to go back to adolescence, and how did that immature frontal lobe, our executive function that controls all of the emotions that come up from our lower brainstem. Again, it's not separated, but they're intricately connected. So you've got the neurocortex here, you've got the emotional limbic center, you got the limbic center, emotional center here, and the brainstem, the survival, fight or flight areas, and it's all mediated by tendrils and connections that are coming down from the prefrontal neurocortex, this little area here. And if this isn't really well formed, the brain becomes hijacked. And all of the emotion and the unregulated survival energy from the brainstem takes over, and you're easily manipulated by that. You're more fearful, you're more prone to not be able to think things through and plan.
Which goes back to the mechanism. And the mechanism that takes advantage of the biology is the propaganda.
Yep. So any respectable authoritarian intuits this, and they know how to control it. It's like, have you ever been around a sociopath, right? And their charm and their eruditeness and their
con madness.
Huh?
Con madness.
Con madness is focused on they have a radar for vulnerability in people and find people who are vulnerable that they can control and power. That powers them up because most of them, this is the people that have this issue, have had severe trauma early in their lives, either neglect, and it's been well documented with Trump. And there was a recent article in a journal that I follow called Adverse Childhood Experiences that talks about toxic stress in childhood, molding and shaping the brain. But wait, it gets even more interesting. So you have to go, not only do you have to go back to adolescence, you have to go back to childhood and fetal life. And how did early life experience cause lifelong changes in the brain function and gene expression that starts in the womb because of the glucocorticosteroids being flooded into the developing fetus by the mother, who is in high states of anxiety
Mm-hmm.
because she has an insecure environment. It could be because of poverty, it could be because of domestic violence, she's a single mom, whatever it is. All of that uncertainty and unpredictability raises the stress hormones in the body, and it goes directly into the fetus. That changes the expression and molds the brain even in utero, preparing it for a hard life outside. And one of the things it does is it grows the amygdala, so it's more reactive, even at birth, which is then reinforced by an environment that is not nurturing and supportive, but rather hostile. But wait, there's more. Then you have to go back. So you got the fertilized egg. What eggs coded for those hormones and neurotransmitters? So you have to go back to the eggs, which means the environment that the mother had growing up. And then decades to millennia before, how did a culture shape the social environment in which they live? And how did the ecological factors shape the culture? So are these honored cultures, cultural violence? How does, and so you look at your ancestors and the genetic line that they passed on to you. So this is understanding that this is our hard wiring, and that because we can understand our hard wiring, we can understand a way out of it and how to bring ourselves out of it.
Oh,
And we,
that's lovely.
and we
Hey,
know how to do it. We know how to do it. We've done it. And in fact, we've got programs all throughout Clark County that are based on what's called trauma-informed practices in child serving agencies and prenatal care in the juvenile court. We're going to do one of that later on. Um, and I was fortunate in my career to be part of that initial movement that came through in, well, the study came out in 1998, and then by 2002, when I heard about it, I was talking to everybody about it, as everybody else was in social services throughout Washington and Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. So
so you mean you were talking about it with everyone? I mean, tell me a little bit about that.
well,
Like,
when I saw those, so I remember my colleague who's a private counselor. I was running the victim services program for the Clark County Juvenile Court, and I was talking about trauma and victim issues and stuff like that. And he said, you ought to read the study that the CDC and Kaiser did on that there's an epidemic of trauma throughout the middle class of the United States, not the more any. So there was like 28% of the middle class that were trauma survivors that had this nervous system that was conditioned by fear and poverty and lack of resources to be hypervigilant. And this was part of what creates the inability to participate in school. They're often misidentified as attention deficit, but really they have post-traumatic stress kind of experiences. So when I was working in juvenile justice, where people were in the victim impact program, we're trying to hold kids accountable in meaningful ways. And we were integrating this model called restorative justice throughout Washington and Oregon. And I said, this is the science that supports looking at developmental psychology and using those to hold kids accountable, and using this idea of giving kids trauma-informed ways to be accountable, and also changing the mindset of their people that are caring for them, as well as the probation counselors, the mental health therapists, the child serving agencies, and all of the entities that help kids recover from help them be better kids and participate in the community, right?
yeah, they just create a sense of belonging. You know what
Create
this
a sense of
makes me
belonging,
think
right?
of?
Yeah.
David, when you say this, it's like on the individual level, it's creating a sense of belonging. So the holding accountable is about, we are not identifying you with your worst mistake, and we're giving you a path in order for you to be held accountable to objective behavior that we all agree upon is correct. And then your other example with your Truman neighborhood makes me think of like those individuals coming together that have that sensibility are creating something positive together, which instead of that amygdala thing that hijacks your brain, you're getting the other is it the prefrontal lobe there that
Prefrontal lobe, yeah.
yeah, that's highly developed, and it takes more time, and it's more deliberative and more relational, and then together you did something positive. And so that's how you have the great good ending on the group level. So you just like talked about it on the individual level and the group level.
Group level. So one of the goals of growing healthy individuals is developing a sense of empathy and caring for other people, right? And that's one of the things that, there's always a conversation about with children growing up. Well, why did you do that to your brother or sister? That was mean and stuff. You have that kind of conversation. But you also have to realize that they're just being kids. And again, part of that research, the neuroscience research, is the reason our brains don't develop. This is established research, been repeated over and over again. Our brains don't fully develop that neural cortex, that control center, for 24 years. And there's a reason for that, because it takes that long to integrate all the social integration and the ability to move in a complex society and to integrate all those social norms. But the good news, we know how to do that, and that's by using empathetic responses to the children and engaging with them in a way that helps them regrow those neural connections, because now we know that you can regrow those neural connections that into your 90s, but especially in children and adolescents that's still formative, you have a lot to work with. And you can then rescue kids, save them from a life of what is often called the school to prison pipeline, and being shunted into special ed and behavioral programs because they can't function in a regular classroom environment, which also changes. So in part of, after I left the juvenile court, I came back full time. I left full time in 2009. I came back on a contract and worked on a MacArthur Foundation grant to integrate this in throughout the juvenile courts throughout Washington. And this was a national program. They were, they do this this funding on promising practices and stuff. So we started integrating this into our work in mental health, child services, and especially on helping kids be accountable by creating mentoring programs for them when they did their community service. They just didn't go out and pick up trash on the side of the road in their vest, but they would do it as community projects with other community members who are giving back to the community. So that became a value, right?
And there's the belonging
instead of the sense of belonging. And those people who they were doing that work with became their mentors. Again, a sense of belonging. And those people in the community that were looking for places to help kids then became mentors at the juvenile court. And then we started talking about, where can we also recruit mentors? Well, we did it from the bachelor level program that had human services, criminal justice curriculums. And we said, if you want to learn about what kids need, come in. And we interviewed them and made them, survey them and see if there would be kids or young people that would be mentoring our young kids. So then you change the educational system and make that a value in the educational system. And then the state of Washington developed a compassionate schools manual that said, because sort of like the HIV universal precautions approach, when you find someone that's bleeding or that's unconscious, that you want to protect yourself from getting the infection, right? That's what they call universal precautions. But there's so many people because of that we knew, including parents and the children, that were sufferers of lifelong trauma and had this challenge, that you needed to look at anybody who came into any service system, that they were likely a survivor of toxic trauma, and they needed to be approached in that way.
It's not
So
just
that,
kids.
huh?
It's not just
No, because, and there was so there was programs that integrated programs for parents, programs for kids, programs for families. He brought it all together with the idea of a trauma-informed approach. So one of the things in the manual I always remember when we were doing these trainings was they started by saying, and knowing this, some of the kids in kindergarten and the K through 5, 6 level are hypervigilant, right? So they recommended little things like putting tennis balls on the bottom of the chairs so they didn't squeak and make people jolt and reactive. I mean, simple things like that. But they also brought in this mindset of you can't reach the mind, you can't teach kids stuff until you reach their heart and you approach their feelings and their needs.
and not
So
an empty stomach either, right?
not an empty stomach either, poverty, and not an empty stomach either. So that's that. I'll get off of that.
Oh, but
But
it's wonderful.
but that's the solution, right?
Yeah.
And also to that also needs to be looked at in terms of our adult prison population,
Right.
right? So I'm in the pandemic, I've been all over YouTube and I even got to watch dog videos. Cute dog videos, but the ones that I was really interested in was I got interested in was people that adopt dogs that have been abused, and then they, in that loving, nurturing environment, they become less fearful, anxious, they don't bite, stuff like that. So imagine you have a kid that's traumatized, and you bring him into a system that continues to shame them and tell them that they're bad, versus trying to understand what the behavior means, because we now understand that based on the neuroscience and the social science.
And also that I think about that phrase, David, instead of, saying to somebody, what's wrong with you? You say, what happened to you?
Mhm. Exactly, exactly. And that's the way, when we look at the biology of hate and how to build resilient communities, is that's the approach we need to have. And you can't be naive about it. And we can't say, that people can blow through the norms and the values, but we say something happened to this person, and I need to understand that. And
Mhm.
one of the ways to do that, according to neuroscience and social scientists, is to do things together as a community where people are doing things for shared values.
Mhm.
You
And
know,
neuroscience seems to teach us not to be so smug. We are all perfectly capable of all of these things.
yes,
And if we didn't have certain mechanisms in place, those of us that do not exhibit those could very well. And I have to say, because for some reason, I'm on this propaganda thing, you know, because the thing is, it occurs to me, David, like when we're talking about like this aspect that we touched on of like, people know that there's something wrong. She fell into the QAnon rabbit hole because she knew that there was something wrong with the way that Bernie Sanders was treated. And what the twist there again, and the truth and the big lie goes to, instead of finding scapegoats, which they're happy to do, the people who again follow the money, who would they be? We can find them, versus finding genuine places to assign blame, because there are parties that are responsible for that.
that's what I was trying to say. Right. Yeah, good.
You were? Because I think you said a lot of great stuff.
Okay, well, that's a nice way of tying it up. So, what helps people who are divided, who've been wounded, and are just sitting shell shocked, right, from like January 6th?
Mhm.
Uh, how do communities heal? And the social scientists and the neuroscientists, again, and the anthropologists and the historians who've tracked about how these things happen, uh, look at when you have an insurgency, what you do is you create jobs, you create meaningful ways for people to connect, you raise their standard of living, so those issues aren't So that's on the economic level.
The Work Products Administration, the Rooseveltian thing that they said it would be like Biden. I mean, I want that to happen. There's a part of me that feels like the powers that be, because and you know, David and I talked about this. We have to do a whole show around this. If 90% of the population across the board believes that money should come out of politics, we're talking libertarians and Republicans and Democrats and Green Party and everybody in between, believes that there should be no money in politics, control for this. And why can't we get campaign finance reform?
Citizens United, right? There's a movement. It has to be a constitutional movement because
And Citizens United, we just have to say, is the Koch brothers, right? So these are multinational corporation heads who
connected
are
to the fossil fuel industry
connected to fossil fuel, who
and
are
to those wonderful infrastructure projects through the World Bank.
right, and who are gutting American production, like what happened in Detroit, in order to get basically enslaved labor so they can continue to grow their profits. And this is the facts of what's happening. And then people that are, and I really do feel bad for some of them that
Oh,
are you know, it's heartbreaking that think that Trump is going to help them when he is actually a shill for those very people. And that's, you know, that's the part I want to be able to in some way, you know, parse and work that out together and be able to simplify it and say, look, you know, here is the smoking gun.
so there's that. And so a certain number of people will as coming back will say similar to I thought it's very similar to the end of times scenarios, right? On this date, you know, in this year, the rapture is going to happen, and you remember all those movements that happened, and people were creating up in the up in North Dakota and Wyoming. They were building underground shelter bunkers and stuff like that. And it was going to be the end of the world. And so so that was new to America, by the way. That came in the early 20s and 30s, militarism and all of this stuff around the end of times and this very fundamentalist evangelical movement was new and is still a part of all that. So there's an answer. The people are looking for answers in those simple movements. If you just do these prescribed things, then you'll be fine, and you will be taken up into heaven, and other people are going to suffer because they weren't true believers, right? It's like my neighbors who think I'm going to hell because I support LGBTQ rights.
And we
so
love that about you.
So a couple of neuroscientists, Sapolsky and then this guy, Lizana Harris from Oxford, was saying, you know, we have decades of research now. We know what helps people work and mend the harms and the wound. And that's having people do shared projects over shared values. So one time, but if that's a one-time thing, people don't get much of a sense of community from that. It has to be repeated over and over again in shared projects. And I'm going to talk a minute about something that happened in our neighborhood that grew out of that rough period we had in 2016, 2017, where people ended up feeling divided, and there was a lot of fear and anxiety. But one of the things that the social scientists say, and this is replicated by neuroscientists, is that you can get a certain boost from that. But if you want people to really start to have a feeling of diversity and acceptance and value of the others, and there be a new other, which is us's, tricky stuff, is that you start in the schools so that you have a diverse student body population throughout K through 12. So the us's become the thems. The thems become the us's. We're all the same.
Yes.
So in my local neighborhood elementary school, for example, We have 65% of the kids on free and reduced lunches, so that means they're impoverished. And then, as I mentioned, our neighborhood association has adopted the school. We have mentors, we volunteer, we bring in vision screening, we support all of that stuff. And we're there the first day of kindergarten to help the kids get off the bus, and because they're all anxious and stuff like that. And the staff is overwhelmed trying to take care of them, right? So we flooded the zone, right, with this. And we have volunteers come in and walk them to the gym where they sit down, and we do things with them, and some of them are crying and stuff like that. Some of them don't even speak English, and we're trying to help them sort things through with their parents and stuff. So, but that's the level of commitment, you know, that communities can have in adopting schools and making a difference. And so what we found was that by going after that thing happened in 2016-17 with the attempted takeover and all the upset and the fear and anxiety about them and the them and us dichotomy that was created, we went back to doing what we had been doing, which was working with the PTA, having a bike. A couple of the people in our neighborhood thought, well, what's a way to really organize? What do kids really want? What parents really want? They want kids to be safe on their bikes. That's a shared value. And what's more fun than riding a dang bike? And I still remember the freedom I had when I got on there and I could ride away from my home in the evening through parking lots and just cruise, you know, hands free too. You know, I got to be 9 and stuff like that. I mean, what a feeling of freedom. And so everybody connected with that. So the brilliant intuition of the council was to create a bike safety rodeo using Bike Clark County and a local bike shop, where we got a grant from one of the people in our neighborhood, their business, to buy helmets for the kids, and also a bike to give away as a raffle.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes. So we created with Bike Clark County a bike safety template on the school ground. So kids would have to go up to a stop sign, turn right, signal, do all that stuff. There were people monitoring it, and then we had, you know, balance challenge course going through back and forth for the older kids and stuff like that. We had helmet fittings. If people they couldn't get on the bike until they had a helmet. If they didn't have a helmet, we had 60 helmets, different sizes. We fitted them. We had people trained to fit the helmets. They walked away with a bike helmet and training course. The PTA had a carnival at the same time, pizza and was shared. And the local church came in, the food bank, and they had food for people that didn't have food in their pantry. Oh. And one of the local churches came in and fed everybody hamburgers and salads and stuff like that. So that was a community event, came together over bike safety. And we've done that for 10 years, I don't know how many years now. About 9 years. So so that's one thing. And then on top of that, we had an annual picnic, and we continued the graffiti cleanup and adopt a park and all that stuff. But on top of that, one of our neighbors who was retired by that point and had a background in mediation and things like that, and dealing with conflict resolution, says, now I wonder what could help bring things together, big people together. And she saw this program down in Ashland, Oregon, called the Green Bag Project, Green Bag Food Collection Project, where every 2 months, donors would sign up and they would commit to taking this card that would be, so there was a nonprofit was created, and there was a card, and you purchased the nonprofit would create the bags, and they would advertise as their neighborhood association throughout the community. And they say, if you want to sign up to be a food donor, every 2 months, all you have to do is fill this green bag with non-perishable items that are needed by the food banks and by the school pantries, because a lot of schools serve kids that don't have food at home or don't, and it's just so heartrending to see that. And of course, if you do that with everybody on the street, you're empty, you get burned out. But here's a compassionate way to contribute and make sure you're doing something. So if you don't give someone $5 sitting on the side of the road, you know that they can go to the food bank and they're going to have food there.
That's
So,
wonderful.
and that was the impetus for this woman named Debbie Nelson in the neighborhood. We'll have a link to that, the program below, is that that this would be a great way to have a shared value of addressing poverty and food inequality and access to food.
Which is pretty widespread from what I understand, David. I
Very
understand that at WSU, food insecurity is 30%.
Yes, and now even more with
Yeah.
the pandemic. I mean, people that had that are just feeling so embarrassed and shameful that they have to show up.
You know, so that you can just get some food
And quality food and toiletries and toothbrushes and deodorant and things like that. So these little mini nonprofits are created in Ashland, and Debbie started it here in Truman. And I got the stats right here. So it's called Clark Neighbors Food Project Green Bag, and it was started in July of 2017, and with 20 food donors. That means 20 households said, yeah, I'll do it. Give me the green bag, and when I go grocery shopping, I'll take this list of products and I will fill this green bag up and put it on my porch every 2 months on a Saturday. And then we have volunteers that go around, pick it up, and then meet at the local elementary school, and the food bank pulls their van around and we fill it up with food. And then that's taken to fish to the food bank. And then what they don't use then is given to the school for the school pantry. So that was 20 vendors, and in July, we had 375 pounds of food collected by those 20 donors in the Truman neighborhood. So we said, well, okay, that's great. Let's keep growing that. So we kept promoting it on social media, on Facebook and stuff like that. And people talked with each other. And then in the 3.5 years since the inception, I just talked with Debbie about this on Saturday, it's grown to more than 1,300 food donors in Truman.
Wow.
With 17,000 pounds of food every 2 months.
Wow.
7 pantries and 5 school resource centers, and we've continued to grow during the pandemic. Actually, that might have been countywide there. That's countywide. But then she thought, well, during the pandemic, it's going to go down. So what are we going to do? But what happened is people recognized the need. They saw the food insecurity that was happening because of the pandemic and people queuing up for hours and hours to get a grocery bag full of food. So they started to give. So since June of 2020, they've added 45 new neighborhoods and 350 food donors. So there we now have 95 neighborhoods in Clark County donating food every 2 months. So since inception in 2017, they've collected 124,105 pounds of food, which translates to 103,000 meals. And according to food bank standards, 100 pounds equals 83 meals.
Wow.
So that's a program that makes a difference, that brings people together. And it was just started by one of our neighborhood leaders who said, I wonder what could help, and saw that and said, well, I got some time, I'll do that. And now you have your green bag that you take to the store with you. You fill it up with canned goods and non-perishable toilet items and stuff like that. So you've got rice, you've got beans, you've got soups, you've got
and peanut butter.
Peanut butter, PMJs, right? Not bread, but PMJs, and then nutrition and all sorts of nutritional food products that people can make. And that spread throughout Clark County, just that one thing. And that came out of the woundedness and the divisiveness that we had in our little neighborhood, all of that. That's the kind of thing that we we, you and I and our community can look to and think about what can bring us together to look at
Mhm.
shared problems that are in front of us, so like the social inequities around food, around transportation, around access to healthcare, around jobs, around community policing, reprioritizing things, all those projects that bring people together over shared values. So so the shared values thing can lead us to our worst selves or to our best selves.
Mhm.
And one of the things I love about the CoolCouve program is that we're trying to promote leading us to our best selves.
Yes. Oh,
And,
it's so
and in the future programs, I'd love to interview some of those folks who are doing these projects out there. Debbie doesn't want to be on camera, but the good news is we have a CTTV 2-minute video on YouTube that she gave us a link to that we can put into the program where people can learn about how to participate in the Green Bag program.
Oh, that's wonderful. And then David, like, do you happen to know, like, like on the other end, if people are hungry, where do they go?
All the food banks have these products. So the food banks, the fish programs, the churches, they're filling it up, and the school pantries. Even though the schools are closed down, they're still feeding the kids in their community, and they have places where families can go drive by and pick up grocery bags of food. And
Okay,
yeah,
that's wonderful. Oh, so it's widely available. That's
it's
wonderful.
widely available. As I said, there are so the food goes to 7 food pantries. So that's like fish. We have 7 of those in Clark County,
Great.
and 5 school family resource centers. So the family resource centers were developed out of this idea of the unmet needs and feeding kids and families so that they can think, right?
Yeah.
If you're sitting there with an empty stomach and you can't think, you can't calculate, and it's just part of the biology of human beings. You can't concentrate, you can't think, you can't focus. If you're hungry, you're not producing the right hormones, and you're more reactive, and yada yada yada. So
We all are.
yeah, we all are. And I'm getting hungry right now.
Okay. Well, and and the other part that I just want to say to you, David, I love this, and I don't, that we're all susceptible, and also to recognize that, there is a bait and switch, and for us to recognize, like, when you were talking earlier, I had this image of, like, the boss kicks the worker, and the worker comes home and kicks the kid, and then the kid kicks the dog, and it's
Exactly right.
so there's this, and of course the people who are at the bottom of that boot are people of color, and particularly women who are also, people of color, and so that we by understanding that that is part of the bait and switch that propaganda takes advantage of, and being willing, like the woman who escaped QAnon, being willing to understand that all of us are susceptible to this, as well as, she said, one of the things that this woman said in this article was that she used to look down on people who were in cults
Mhm.
until she realized that she herself was in one. And so, that it may take a little bit more deliberation and identification and willingness to see, but again, it's all of us, and we literally are hardwired for that hatred, and we are also hardwired for that amazing empathy that creates resilient communities.
And and that, I'm glad you said that, because that's where compassion comes from, because it's clearly, it's only luck that you were born into that family, that you came from that particular zygote, that your environment, and that it was a healthy environment, healthy enough perhaps, in the mother's womb. But guess what? Family dynamics change, family resources change. And this is the thing that I was always thinking of when I was working in my 40 years career in mental health is, well, why does one kid turn out this way and one kid turn out that way?
Yeah.
And that was always the thing. Well, we got the good kids, and then this one kid we don't know what to do with, right? You know, that's always the story, right? And well, the the epigenetic environment changed. The family resources changed, the emotional resources that the kid had. When I was living in California, there was a family across from us that have 11 children. They had a lot of resources, but the kids were being raised by the older kids, right? And depending on the family dynamics, that could be a lot of trauma and bullying, or it could be a very loving environment. But it's just luck. It's just luck. And knowing that gives me a sense of understanding and compassion for fellow human beings. If we can get that message out and a way for people to participate and avenue and do outreach and bring people in and say, here's a place where you can plug in, you know, do what you want to do, make things different.
So we're gonna listen to what David had to say. We're gonna say goodbye to everybody. But David and I are gonna come back with this wonderful idea of amplifying people right here in Clark County that are doing the very things that you had this wonderful story that that certainly paralleled many of the things that happened on January 6th and ended up being such a
And has wonderful outcomes. But the thing was to use your, so to do, we had to do the hard things. We had to hang in there and listen and work with people long term and go back to our social capital and our relationships and continue to engage people. So many of the people that were involved in what happened back in 2016 are now fully, you know, there's none of that animosity anymore. It's just we're all working on it together. People are showing up and doing the things, you know, together. So
that's so nice.
it's yeah, it's
So
so
hard because sometimes it feels like there's all bad news, and then you have this perfectly wonderful example of exactly what we're talking about.
and you see it everywhere. I mean, you're working on, you know, in the community on transportation board and stuff like that, and bringing people together around that. And you have your voice there. And I work on social justice issues and
Sure do. And we're going to have some really good shows with you and Cat Meow and Juvenile Restorative Justice.
juvenile justice, restorative justice.
Yeah.
That's however long I live, I'll be working on that.
Oh, good. Then let it be a long, long, healthy time.
Yeah. So be it. Okay.
So are you stopping? Say goodbye.
Bye. See you
Bye,
next time.
everybody. This
Bye.
is CoolCouve. You're supposed to say, stay cool.
Oh, stay cool. Stay cool in the couve.
Yeah.
Here we go.